Confess one thing to me. In silence, in your head, you don't need to say it out loud. Confess it only to yourself. Have you ever pretended to believe in something that, deep down, you knew you didn't believe? It could have been at a Sunday Mass, when everyone around you had their eyes closed reciting a prayer by heart, and you found yourself just moving your lips silently. It could have been when you said amen after a sentence that made no sense to you. It could have been at a funeral, listening to the priest assure that the deceased was now in a better place, while you looked at the fresh earth of the grave and felt, without the courage to admit it, that all of it sounded like a very beautiful story told to children afraid of the dark. If this has happened to you, even just once, even for a single second, then you need to hear what I'm going to say now. You were not alone at that time. The 11 apostles were also pretending. 10 of them pretended better. Only one had the courage to admit it. His name was Thomas, and that's why, exactly because of that, for 2,000 years the church needed to destroy his reputation, because the silence of the other 10 is the dirtiest secret of primitive Christianity. And as long as Thomas existed in the memory of the faithful as an honest man, this secret risked being discovered. So they did what is always done with inconvenient witnesses. They turned him into a joke, into a proverb, into an insult. Don't be a Thomas. Don't be an unbelieving Thomas. As if demanding proof before accepting the supernatural were a moral flaw and not the most basic operation of human intelligence. But I want you to close your eyes for a moment. Not literally, of course, you're watching a video you need to see. Close the eyes of memory, of imagination, and follow me to a room in Jerusalem in the year 33 of our era, 3 days after one of the most public and violent deaths that city had ever witnessed. The room is small, it smells of fear. This is not a metaphor, it's literal. The sweat of 11 men huddled together for 72 hours has its own acidic smell, mixed with the smoke from the oil lamps and the barley dust from the bread they tried to eat but couldn't swallow. The windows are closed, the doors have double locks. Outside, Roman soldiers are asking house by house, and even within 4 walls no one dares to speak louder than a whisper. These 11 men left everything 3 years earlier. They left families, they left fishing boats, they left businesses, they left fiancés, they left sick parents. Why? Because of a wandering carpenter who promised something that no other prophet in history had promised, that the kingdom of God was coming, that they would sit on thrones, that this would be the last generation before the end of the world. And then this carpenter died, nailed to a piece of wood, like any common thief, with soldiers laughing at him while he agonized. Can you imagine what goes through the mind of a man who left his entire family to follow someone and discovers 3 years later that perhaps he left his entire family for nothing? It's not pain. Pain is too little. It's a cosmic shame. It's a dull anger. It's a void that pulses in the stomach and doesn't let you sleep. It's the humiliating certainty that you were deceived, and worse, that you deceived yourself, because no one forced you to believe, no one pulled you by the arm, you went of your own free will, and now the life you threw away can no longer be recovered. It's in this state that the 11 were, and then, at the height of this devastation, someone appears saying that he has returned, that he is alive, that he has been seen. Think about what happens inside the hearts of these men. Think slowly. They have 2 options. The first is to hold on to the pain, the shame, the void, and admit that the dream is over. The second is to cling to this crazy news like a castaway clings to a piece of wood in the middle of the ocean. To believe, not because it is true, but because the alternative is to drown. 10 of them clung. Thomas did not. Thomas looked at the other 10 and realized something that broke his heart in 2. He realized that those men, his brothers, his friends, the companions of 3 years on the road, were no longer there. What was their despair dressed in the clothes of faith, and Thomas, who loved each of them, who had walked through the same deserts, who had slept on the same stone floors, had enough courage to look into their eyes and say no, not to hurt, not to mock, not to destroy, but to rescue. Because he knew that a faith built on the fear of facing reality will never hold anyone when the storm truly arrives. And this is where our second character comes in, a man who would live 1,600 years after that scene, a man who would never set foot in Jerusalem, A man who wasn't even a Christian. A Jew from Amsterdam, the son of Portuguese merchants fleeing the Inquisition, who at 23 was excommunicated from his own synagogue for saying things that even Christians had no courage to hear. This man was named Baruch Spinoza, and he did something that no philosopher before him had the audacity to do. He took the Gospels, the same Gospels that all of Europe read on their knees, and analyzed each word as if he were analyzing any other text, without reverence, without submission, without the fear that has surrounded these books for 2,000 years, only with reason, only with honesty, only with that cold courage of the thinker who refuses to kneel before any page, no matter how sacred it is considered. And when he reached chapter 20 of the Gospel of John in the scene of Thomas, he stopped. He went back, he reread, and then he wrote with a steady hand a few lines that would change the world. Lines that would cost him his peace, his family, his people, his health, and in the end, his very life. What Spinoza saw in that scene, what no one before him had seen in 1,600 years of Christian reading, is the most disturbing thing you will hear today, and I will tell you. But there's one detail you need to know before we move on. Spinoza died young, 44 years old, coughing blood, with lungs destroyed by the glass dust of the lenses he polished to survive, without family around his bed, without a priest, without a rabbi, without close friends, because almost all had been forced to distance themselves from him after the excommunication. Alone in a rented room in The Hague under the roof with a single candle burning. And do you know what his last words were? According to the account of the landlady who took care of the house. He asked for a chicken soup. He had the soup. He smiled at her, asked her to extinguish the candle, and said, with a voice almost breathless before closing his eyes forever, a single phrase. A phrase that seems simple but carries within it the entire thought of a lifetime dedicated to understanding what happened in that room in Jerusalem with Thomas. He said, "The truth does not hurt. What hurts is the fear of the truth." And he died. Now, with these words resonating, with this room in Jerusalem still open in your mind, with this forbidden question pulsing in the back of your chest, I ask you one last thing before we begin. Do you have the courage to follow this story to the end? Because if you do, I guarantee you, when this video ends, you will look at the word doubt and never feel that it is a flaw again. You will feel for the first time in your life that it is a gift, the rarest gift a human being can offer to the world. The gift that Thomas offered in a closed room in Jerusalem. The gift that Spinoza offered in a dark basement in Amsterdam. The gift that now, at this very moment, is being delivered again into your hands. The story begins here, and it cannot be undone. Is this introduction block good for you? Can I continue with block 1? You said, do until 8 and then ask if I want to continue. Do until 8 and then ask if I want to continue. 11. 06, Claude replied, block 1. Structured an extensive narrative about Thomas and Spinoza in 8 blocks. Block 1. The city smelled of fear. Jerusalem, in that spring of 33 AD, was not the golden city of biblical postcards. It was an occupied city, a military city, Roman soldiers on every corner, spears resting on the ground, bronze helmets shining under an unrelenting April sun. The Jews walked with their heads down through the narrow streets, avoiding the gaze of the legionaries, knowing that any suspicion could end in a beating in a cell or on a cross on Golgotha, outside the walls. And that's exactly what happened that Friday. That Friday that would later be called Good Friday, but for the 11 men we are about to meet, was simply the worst day of their lives, the day their world ended. The day everything they had believed for 3 years was nailed to a piece of wood before their eyes and died slowly, with its chest rising and falling more and more slowly until it stopped rising. You need to understand one thing about crucifixion, because movies, paintings, images of Christ on church walls, all of them lie about the real violence of it. Roman crucifixion was not an execution. It was a spectacle. It was an example. It was a political tool to terrorize entire populations and remind them every day who was in charge there. The Romans didn't just nail hands. They nailed wrists below the thumb line at the exact point where a thick nerve crosses the bone. Every time the crucified tried to breathe, They had to push up on their nailed feet, and that movement sent a wave of pain through the nerves of the hands to the shoulders. The person died of asphyxiation, slowly, sometimes in hours, sometimes in days. Jesus of Nazareth died in a few hours. The Gospels say this with a certain haste, as if they wanted to turn the page, but the hours he spent there, suspended between two thieves, were hours when the apostles were watching from afar, hiding behind stones, behind women, behind anything that made them seem less suspicious. They were watching, unable to do anything, their master agonizing. And when he finally bowed his head and stopped breathing, something happened inside those men that changed them forever. It wasn't morning. Morning comes later. What happened in that first moment, with the sun setting over Golgotha and the Roman drums beating in the distance, was a cosmic void, a feeling that the entire universe had been deceived, because they were not ordinary followers. They had seen things. They had seen, with their own eyes, water turn into wine, bread multiply, the blind see. They had walked on dusty roads beside that man, hearing words that seemed to descend from heaven straight into their souls. And now this same man was hanging on a pole, with blood drying on his feet, dead like any other condemned man. If that man was God, then God had died. If he was not God, then they had left everything to follow a charlatan. There was no third option at that moment. Either God was dead, or they were the 11 biggest idiots in the Roman Empire. The 11 scattered. Peter fled first. That Peter who 2 days earlier had sworn, with his chest puffed out, that he would die for the Master if necessary. This same Peter, even before the rooster crowed for the 3rd time, had denied 3 times that he knew Jesus, swearing by God and by his ancestors that he had never seen that man in his life. Peter fled to a house somewhere in the lower city of Jerusalem, and there he cried on his knees alone with his forehead against the wall, feeling a disgust for himself that he would carry for the rest of his life. John and James, the sons of Zebedee, fled together. John was the youngest, perhaps still a teenager, and was the only one of the 11 who dared to stay near the cross until the end. But later, when the body was taken down, he too hid. Matthew, the former tax collector, was more afraid of the Romans than anyone else, because a tax collector knew exactly how the system worked. He knew that the Romans would not stop at Jesus. They would go after the followers too. And Matthew, who had abandoned a comfortable life to follow the Master, knew he would be hunted first. Philip, Bartholomew, James son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, all ran, each to a different hole, scattered through the city like rats. And there was, finally, Thomas. Thomas of Didymus, which means the twin in Aramaic and Greek, was a different man from the others from the beginning. The Gospels hardly speak of him. He appears in a few lines, but the few lines in which he appears are revealing. In one of them, when Jesus announces that he is going to Bethany to raise Lazarus, the other apostles try to stop him because they know that returning to that region means certain death. And it is Thomas, only Thomas, who stands up and says to the others, "Let us go with him, that we may die with him." This is a phrase that no one comments on. No one. But it reveals who this man was. Thomas was not a coward. Thomas was not afraid of dying. Thomas had something much rarer than courage. Thomas had lucidity. And lucidity, on that Friday of crucifixion, was the most dangerous thing in the world to have. While the others ran in panic, while Peter cried on his knees in the corner of some house, while John tried to support Mary, the mother of the crucified, Thomas did something that no one else did. He walked alone through the city. He passed through the closed market, through the empty streets, through the locked doors. He sat on the steps of a synagogue that was deactivated because of Passover, and he stayed there, looking at the sky, thinking, trying to understand. Thomas was not fleeing, Thomas was not crying, Thomas was processing. And it is precisely this behavior of a man who needs to think before feeling, that would define everything that happened in the following days. Here, let me introduce you to an idea that will stay with you until the end of this story. There are 2 basic ways to react to a tragedy. The first is to surrender to emotion, to cry, to scream, to pray, to deny, to seek comfort in the arms of others. This is the reaction of the 10. The second is to isolate oneself, to remain silent, and to try to understand what happened. This is the reaction of Thomas. The first reaction is more human in the sense of more common. The second is more philosophical, and history, over 2,000 years, has treated the two very unequally. The first has been praised as faith. The second has been accused as unbelief. But what Spinoza saw 1,600 years later is that this classification is reversed. The first is an emotional escape disguised as virtue. The second is the honest search for truth. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to that Friday. At night, when the city gates were closed, when mourning began to settle among the women of the group, when Mary Magdalene was crying sitting in a corner of some sympathizer's house, and the other Mary was supporting the mother of Jesus, the 11 began one by one to gather again, not by planning, by instinct, like wounded animals that come together to protect each other in the dark. The house where they gathered is not precisely named in the Gospels. Tradition says it was the same house where they had the Last Supper 2 days earlier. A room on the second floor with windows facing the street and a single thick wooden door that locked from the inside with a bar. They climbed the stairs one by one. Peter arrived last, with red eyes, unable to look into the eyes of the others. No one rebuked him for the denial. They themselves had fled. Who was he to judge? But someone was missing. Thomas was not among them. And it is here, in this detail that seems small but is gigantic, that our story begins to gain density. The other 10 gathered. Thomas did not. Why? The Gospels do not say. Christian tradition has invented several explanations, all of them embarrassed, all of them trying to account for this gap. But Spinoza, 1,600 years later, upon rereading this scene, stopped, and he realized something very simple, very devastating. Thomas did not go to the meeting because Thomas did not need a meeting. The others needed to see each other to confirm each other. They needed human warmth to sustain what little faith they had left. But Thomas, with that frightening lucidity that characterized him, knew that no amount of human warmth could fix what had been broken. Thomas was alone somewhere in Jerusalem that night, perhaps at a relative's house, perhaps in a street corner, perhaps in the empty synagogue itself. And while the other 10 embraced behind locked doors, Thomas was sitting in silence, processing the impossible. It was in this absence, in this chosen solitude, that the stage was set for the most important scene in the history of Christianity, the scene that would define 2,000 years later what it means to have faith, and what it means to have the courage to doubt. But to understand this scene, we need to go through the longest night of that group, the night of Saturday, the night that separates the crucifixion from the resurrection, the night when 10 men, behind a locked door, will look at each other not knowing what to say, not knowing what to do, not knowing if they still exist as disciples of any master, or if they have come to exist only as survivors of a collective illusion that cost 3 years of their lives. And while they looked into the nothingness in silence, Thomas, somewhere else in that city, was doing exactly the same thing, only alone, only without needing the comfort of others, only with a cold serenity that no one understood, and that was ultimately the greatest virtue that that group possessed without knowing. Night fell over Jerusalem, and the entire universe seemed to stop breathing for a few hours. Is this block good for you? Block 2. The morning of Sunday dawned grey. It was not a morning of hallelujahs and triumphant songs, as centuries of Christian iconography would represent. It was an ordinary morning, cold, grey. The sun could barely break through a layer of low clouds that covered the city of Jerusalem like an old sheet. Roosters crowed in backyards. Bakers lit their ovens. The Romans changed the guard at the gates. A Sunday morning, in all its existential emptiness, resembling any other morning in the world. It was in this emptiness that Mary Magdalene left through the back door of the house where she was staying and began to walk toward Golgotha. She was not seeking any miracle. Those who seek miracles do not carry a jar of myrrh. Mary Magdalene was bringing herbs and perfumed oils to complete the funeral ritual that had been interrupted on Friday by the onset of the Sabbath. It was a gesture of love, yes, but it was also a gesture of final farewell, of acceptance. Mary Magdalene was going to fulfill the last obligation that is fulfilled for a dead person, and after that life, supposedly, would continue. You know what she found. The Gospels tell the scene in 4 different ways, and none of them fully agree with the others, but the core is the same. The stone sealing the tomb was removed. The body was not there. And at some point, under circumstances that each Gospel describes differently, Mary Magdalene has an experience that she will report as having seen Jesus himself, alive, speaking to her, calling her by name. Mary Magdalene ran back to the house where the 11 were. She knocked on the door she said she had seen. The Gospels accurately record the reaction of the apostles. They did not believe. Mark is especially direct about this. He says, in no uncertain terms, that the 11 did not believe her. Mary Magdalene was crying, was breathless, was being received with pitying looks, as if she had lost her mind from the pain. And Peter with John decided, more out of duty than conviction, to go to the tomb to check. They went. They found the tomb empty. They returned in silence. And their silence, on that way back, is more revealing than any word. They did not know what to think. An empty tomb is not resurrection. An empty tomb is first and foremost a suspicion of body theft. It was a common practice at that time. The high priests might have ordered the body removed to prevent the tomb from becoming a pilgrimage site. Roman soldiers might have taken the body. Even the disciples themselves could be suspects. Peter and John returned to the house not knowing what to say to the others. And then, according to the Gospel of John, on the night of that Sunday, with the doors still locked for fear of the Jews, it happened. Jesus appeared in the midst of them. Here I need to ask you one thing. Don't skip the next part. No matter how much it seems like a scene you already know by heart, no matter how much it seems like one of those passages repeated 1,000 times in Sunday sermons, I sincerely ask you to read what comes next, as if you had never heard this story before, as if you were a 21st century reader, with a scientific background, with an analytical mind, without religious weight. Do this exercise with me. It will be important. The scene described in the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 19 onward, says the following. The disciples were gathered with the doors locked, for fear of the Jews. Jesus came and stood in the midst of them. He said, "Peace be with you." He showed them his hands and his side, and the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. This is the official narrative. It is the narrative that 2 billion Christians in the world accept without question. And it is exactly here, at this point, that Spinoza, 1,600 years later, upon reading this same passage, stopped and asked a question that no one before him had the courage to ask. He asked, how exactly did Jesus enter the room? Think about it. The door was locked. The 10 were inside. Suddenly, Jesus is in the midst of them. It doesn't say that the door opened. It doesn't say that someone unlocked it. It just says, Jesus came and stood in the midst of them. For an ancient reader, this could mean anything. Miraculous apparition, spiritual materialization, physical translocation. But for a thinking reader, this means exactly one thing. The author of the text is describing an experience that, at that moment, transcended the limits of known physics. In other words, he is describing, in narrative language, a subjective internal experience that the apostles had collectively. Spinoza saw this, and he saw more. He saw that none of the other Gospels describes this same scene in the same way. Luke describes a Jesus who asks for a piece of roasted fish and eats in front of them, demonstrating that he has a physical body. John describes a Jesus who appears and disappears through locked doors, demonstrating that he does not have a conventional physical body. Mark, in the oldest version of the Gospel, does not even describe appearances. It simply ends with the women finding the empty tomb and fleeing in silence because of fear. Matthew has his own version in Galilee on a mountain. 4 authors, 4 versions. None of them agrees on the details. And it is here, exactly here, at this moment in our story, that I need to pause for a moment and look at you on the other side of the screen. You are still here. Think about it. Of every 100 people who start watching a video on YouTube, how many make it to the halfway point? 7. maybe 8. The other 92 slip away to the next video, to the next notifier, to the next stimulus, but you didn't. You made it here. And this is not by chance. This means, and I say this with all due respect, that you are different. You have that rare type of restlessness that moves history, that same restlessness that moved Thomas in that room, that same restlessness that moved Spinoza in that basement in Amsterdam, that same restlessness that moves every soul that refuses to settle for ready-made answers. So let me make you a request, from seeker to seeker. Before we continue, write something in the comments of this video. I want to know. If you were in that room with the doors locked, with the fear of the Romans outside, with the pain of the crucifixion still fresh in your chest, and someone appeared in the middle of the group saying, "Peace be with you," would you have fallen to your knees like the 10? Or would you have asked to touch like Thomas? Think honestly. Write in the comments. I will read each one, I swear. Because the comments of this video will become, in a few days, a small treasure of human honesty. A place where people who have never seen each other, who live in different cities, in different countries, will share the same thing. The silent confession that doubt, at some point, passed through their hearts. And while you think about what to write, do one last thing for me. Hit the subscribe button down below. It's not a favor for the channel, it's protection for you. Because stories like this, stories that shake ancient foundations, inherited convictions, with questions that no one wants to ask out loud, these stories are rare. And the YouTube algorithm will not bring you back to these stories if you are not subscribed. It will push you to the next noisy video, to the next disposable content, to the next noise. But if you subscribe now and activate the bell, you will be notified every time a new story like this is published. You will have access to a small circle of people who still believe that thinking is a form of prayer, that doubting is a form of respect, that understanding is the greatest human adventure. Do this now. Comment, subscribe, and come back to me. Because the story is only going to start getting truly dangerous now. Where were we? Yes. The room. The 10. The appearance. The Gospels describe joy. But joy is not the only possible emotion in the face of an appearance of that nature. Think again. You are in a closed room with 9 other people. All of you are devastated by the recent death of a friend. All of you are afraid of the regime's secret police. And then in the middle of you, out of nowhere, without an open door, without warning, without sound, a figure identical to the dead friend appears, with wounds on his wrists, with an open wound on his chest saying, "Peace be with you." Would you have felt joy immediately? Or would you have felt before joy a cosmic terror so deep that it would paralyze your muscles? The other Gospels, more honest at this point, describe that the apostles were terrified. Luke uses the Greek word ptothentes, which means overcome with fear. They thought it was a ghost, a spirit, a collective hallucination induced by pain. It was only later, according to Luke, when Jesus asked them to touch his hands, to see his feet, to eat a piece of roasted fish in front of them, that the apostles began to accept that it was real. That is to say, even the 10 had their initial doubts. Luke records this. The Gospels record this. But Christian tradition, over the centuries, has softened this part. It has smoothed out this roughness. It has transformed the complex, ambiguous human reaction of the 10 into a simple and one-dimensional reaction of immediate faith. Why? Because it was necessary to build a clean opposition between them and Thomas. It was necessary to have a villain of unbelief to serve as an example of what one should not be. And the chosen villain, or rather the constructed villain, was Thomas. But Thomas was not there. Thomas saw nothing. Thomas was in another corner of Jerusalem, sitting in silence, processing the impossible. And when, hours later, he finally returned to the house where the 10 were and was greeted by 10 men with shining eyes, gesticulating frantically, all saying at once, "Thomas, he appeared, he was here, he is alive," the first thing Thomas felt was not disbelief. It was pity. Pity for his brothers, pity for his friends, pity for men who had lost so much, suffered so much, and were now clinging to that story with the desperation of someone drowning. And it was with this pity in his chest, with this deep love for his companions, that Thomas did something that would change his reputation forever. Thomas said no. This block is good for you? Block 3. If I do not see in your hands the mark of the nails, and do not put my finger in the place of the nails, and do not put my hand in your side, I will never believe. This is the phrase, the most famous phrase of Thomas, the phrase that crucified him in the eyes of history, the phrase that has become, over 2,000 years, synonymous with everything that Christian faith supposedly despises. The phrase that is cited in Sunday sermons, in catechism books, in conversations among believers, always with that condescending tone of someone speaking about a child who still hasn't understood a basic lesson. But I ask you once again, not to read this phrase as it is usually read. I ask you to read it as Spinoza read it. Slowly, with attention, word by word. First, note what Thomas is not saying. He is not saying you are liars. He is not saying this is impossible. He is not saying I will never believe this story. Thomas is saying, with a linguistic precision almost scientific, exactly what would need to happen for him to believe. He is establishing criteria. He is formulating a verifiable hypothesis. He is doing, in other words, science. Think about it. In the 1st century of our era, in a closed room in Jerusalem, without books, without schools, without a formalized scientific method, without Aristotle yet translated into the Jewish intellectual environment, a fisherman from Galilee formulates an empirical test to verify an extraordinary claim. He does not reject the claim. He asks for proof, and he asks for specific, measurable, replicable proof. This, my friend, is the oldest definition of scientific epistemology that exists in a Western religious text, and it is spoken by the one whom history would call the doubter. The irony is so great that it hurts. When Spinoza came to this passage in the basement of his house in Rheinsberg, near Leiden, after already having been excommunicated, living on the miserable salary he earned polishing lenses, with the flickering candle over the paper, he wrote a sentence in his personal notebooks that would take centuries to be published. The sentence, in Latin, said something like this: Thomas is the only philosopher in this gospel. The others are apostles. Thomas is alone the method. Reflect on this for a moment. Thomas is the method, not the feeling, not the obedience, not the submission, the method, the rational operation of demanding that a statement be supported by evidence before being accepted as true. That is what separates Thomas from the other 10. It is not that he did not love Jesus. He loved as much as anyone, perhaps more. He was the one who offered to die with Jesus when no one else wanted to go back to Judea. He was the one who said, "Let us go with him, that we may die with him." This is not a man with little faith. This is a man with such great faith that he is not willing to contaminate it with any lie, not even a pious lie. And here we come to a point that may seem strange but needs to be said. Thomas was not doubting the existence of Jesus. Thomas was doubting the testimony of the other 10. Think again about the situation. Those 10 men for 72 hours had gone through the worst psychological trauma of their lives. They had seen the master arrested. They had fled. They had hidden. They had cried. They had hated themselves for fleeing. They had reunited. They had spent Friday night without sleeping, the entire Saturday in silence, in fasting, in fear. On Sunday morning they had heard the confused account of Mary Magdalene. Peter and John had gone to the tomb and returned in silence. The group was in such an extreme state of emotional exhaustion that any relief, any whisper of good news could be interpreted as reality. Thomas knew this. He had seen from afar, from the corner of the synagogue where he was sitting in silence, how panic spreads among human beings, how hopelessness can turn into shared hallucination, how 10 people in the right state of vulnerability can see the same thing that is not there, simply because they need to see. Thomas felt pity for his brothers, and precisely because he felt pity for them, he could not simply accept their testimony without his own investigation. See the difference. The apostles asked Thomas to believe in them. Thomas replied that he needed to believe in Jesus. And to believe in Jesus, he needed to see Jesus, not the 10. Jesus. This is a gesture of respect, not disrespect. Thomas is indirectly but unequivocally saying that the truth about a resurrection is too great to be supported only by 10 traumatized men, that if that resurrection really happened, It deserves a more robust testimony than the emotional account of companions in a state of shock. That if Jesus really returned, Jesus will return again for Thomas. Because a Jesus who appears only to those who were already ready to believe is not an interesting Jesus. It is a useless Jesus. The 10 fell silent after Thomas's statement. Imagine the scene. They had spent the whole day in a state of euphoria. They had talked to each other, repeating the story. They had reconstructed every detail, where Jesus had stepped, where he had raised his hands, the sound of his voice, the roasted fish he had eaten. Matthew, with the instinct of a tax collector, had started taking notes. Peter had prayed aloud. And then Thomas arrives, hears everything, and says he does not believe. The effect on the group must have been brutal. As if someone had thrown a bucket of cold water on the fire they had worked so hard to kindle. Peter, who was impulsive, may have gotten angry. John, who was sweet, may have tried to argue. Matthew, who was pragmatic, may have asked Thomas to calm down. But Thomas did not calm down. Thomas did not offend anyone. Thomas did not fight. He simply said with that terrible calm of lucid men that he did not believe, and continued dining and continued sitting among them, and continued being one of the 11. This last detail is important. Thomas did not leave the group. Thomas did not distance himself. Thomas did not go live elsewhere. Thomas continued being an apostle, sharing bread with the others, sleeping in the same room, walking the same streets. Thomas's doubt did not isolate him, did not expel him, did not turn him into an enemy of the others. The others had to live with him doubting, and this perhaps is the greatest practical lesson this story offers us. You can doubt and still belong. You can say, I do not believe in this, and still be a friend, brother, companion, member of the community. Doubt does not exclude you. What excludes you are the others, when they cannot bear your doubt. And that is exactly what happened centuries later with the memory of Thomas. The others could not bear that there had existed among them a man who doubted and yet lived a holy life. It was necessary to punish this memory. It was necessary to build a narrative in which Thomas was the bad example. Otherwise, the bad example would be the others, the 10 who believed too soon, the 10 who needed less. The following week was strange in the house of the 11. The Gospels summarize this week in a single sentence, 8 days later, as if nothing had happened in those 8 days. But Spinoza, upon reading this gap, wrote a sharp observation in his notebook. He said that the 8 days between the first and second appearance are the most interesting part of the entire chapter, because it was in those 8 days that Thomas had time to think, and that the others had time to doubt their own certainties. Imagine the dynamic. 10 men who had supposedly seen the risen Christ sharing a house with an 11th who refused to believe. For 8 days, eating together, praying together, talking together. Gradually, the initial euphoria of the 10 begins to cool. Questions start to arise. Why didn't he appear again? Did he really appear? Was it a hallucination, as Thomas is suggesting? Does Thomas have a point? Peter, especially Peter, must have gone through an inner agony during this period, because Peter was a leader. Peter needed to sustain the faith of the group, but Peter was also human, and the silent, serene, non-accusatory presence of Thomas in the house was like a mirror. Every time Peter looked at Thomas, he wondered if Thomas might be right, if the appearance on Sunday might have been just a collective daydream born from exhaustion. Thomas, for his part, was not campaigning against the faith of the others. He was not trying to convince anyone of his doubt. He was just there, in silence, eating, praying in his own way, looking at the sky, waiting. Thomas was waiting for one thing. He was not waiting for Jesus to appear. He was waiting for something much harder. He was waiting to discover if he, Thomas, could live with himself if, in the end, he was wrong. And if he was right, if he could live with himself being the only one among the 11. To know the truth, it was a huge weight. It was a weight that no other apostle carried. It was the weight of being the only thinker in a room full of believers. And it was with this weight on his shoulders that Thomas arrived on the 8th day. This block is good for you? Block 4. To understand what happened on the 8th day, I need to introduce you to Thomas for real. Not the Thomas of the myth, not the Thomas of catechesis, not the Thomas of the holy cards that circulated through the parishes in the countryside. I need to introduce you to the man of flesh and blood. Because without understanding who Thomas was before that 8th day, it is impossible to understand the real significance of what he did when Jesus reappeared. The name Thomas in Aramaic is Toma. It literally means twin. In Greek, the translation became Didymus. The Gospels call him this twice. Thomas called Didymus, as if they wanted to emphasize this characteristic. The man was a twin, but who his brother was no one knows. Some very ancient traditions, later considered apocryphal and excluded from the official canon, suggest astonishing things. One of them, recorded in the so-called Acts of Thomas, written in the 3rd century in Syria, suggests that Thomas was the twin brother of Jesus himself. I am not saying that this is true. I am just saying that there is an ancient document, written by Syrian Christians of the early generations, that claims this kinship. Spinoza knew these texts. He read in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. He had access to a huge library through the friends he had in heterodox circles in Amsterdam. And Spinoza, in one of his marginal notes, wrote an impressive sentence. He said that if Thomas was indeed a close relative of Jesus, it explains a lot. It explains why he, and only he, had the courage to demand proof. Those who grow up with someone know that that someone is human. He is not a myth, he is not a deity, he is a man. And those who know that the other is a man, when that other dies, need solid evidence to believe that he has come back to life. But let's set this hypothesis aside for now. Let's return to what we know for sure. Thomas was one of the 12. He was personally chosen by Jesus, according to the Synoptic Gospels at the beginning of the ministry. We do not know his profession. The other apostles have recorded professions. Peter was a fisherman. Matthew was a tax collector. Simon was a zealot. Of Thomas, nothing. This suggests that he was probably something between these two things. Either he had a profession so common that it was not worth mentioning, which is unlikely, or he had a profession so delicate that the authors of the Gospels preferred not to record it. Spinoza raised an interesting hypothesis. He said that Thomas may have been a scribe, a literate man, perhaps of urban origin, not rural. This would explain the analytical capacity he demonstrates at various moments in the text, and it would also explain why he was, in later tradition, identified as the author of Gospels, Acts, and apocryphal Acts. The other apostles were illiterate or semi-illiterate. Thomas was different. The first time Thomas appears speaking in the Gospels is in a scene that few comment on, but that defines his character once and for all. It is in the Gospel of John, chapter 11. Lazarus has just died. Lazarus was a personal friend of Jesus. He was in Bethany, a city close to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem, at that point in Jesus' ministry, was a danger zone. The high priests had already ordered Jesus' arrest. They had tried to stone him a few months earlier. Going back to the Jerusalem area meant practically walking into the lion's mouth. Jesus announces that he is going. The apostles protest, "Master, just now the Jews tried to stone you and you are going there again." It is the natural reaction. It is the rational reaction. It is the reaction that any of us would have. But Jesus is determined. And then comes Thomas's phrase. Thomas looks at the other 10 and says, "Let us also go that we may die with him." To die with him, not to protest, not to prevent, not to come up with a plan to escape. Let's go with him, and if he dies, we will die with him. This is the phrase of a man who is not afraid of death, who has no illusion about what is going to happen, who accepts the harsh reality as it is, but who also has an absolute loyalty to the one he has decided to follow. Think about this apparent contradiction. The same man who is willing to die with Jesus is the man who, 3 years later, will demand physical proof of Jesus' resurrection. How can this be? How can a man have such loyalty and such doubt at the same time? The answer is that it is not a contradiction. It is the same thing. Thomas's loyalty is not blind. It is conscious. He follows Jesus because he chose to follow Jesus, because he examined Jesus, because he lived with Jesus, because he concluded, after careful evaluation, that it was worth following Jesus even unto death. And it is precisely because this loyalty is conscious, rational, founded on evidence accumulated over 3 years of living together, that he demands at the most extreme moment evidence commensurate with that loyalty. Thomas will not accept a second-hand Jesus, a Jesus told by others, a Jesus rumor. He wants the Jesus of flesh and blood, with nails in his wrists, with a wound in his chest. He wants the real Jesus, or he prefers authentic mourning for the death of the Jesus he loved. There is another scene also in the Gospel of John where Thomas appears speaking. It is in chapter 14. Jesus is giving the Last Supper discourse. He tells the apostles that he is going to a place to prepare a dwelling for them, and then he says, "You know where I am going, and you know the way." And Thomas, alone, with that brutal honesty that was his hallmark, raises his hand and says, "Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way?" This is another devastating phrase. The other apostles are sitting, nodding their heads, pretending to understand. Thomas, alone, says he does not understand. "I do not understand. I do not know where you are going. I do not know how to get there. Explain it to me." And it is in response to this question from Thomas that Jesus says one of the most famous phrases in all the Gospels, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Note this, one of the most quoted phrases in Christianity, engraved in marble in millions of churches around the world, exists only because Thomas had the courage to admit that he did not understand. If Thomas had remained silent, pretending to understand like the others, this phrase would not have been said. The entire Christian orthodoxy owes this phrase to a single moment of intellectual honesty from Thomas. And it is this same man, this same Thomas, who 8 days after the resurrection will tell the others that he needs to see to believe. The continuity of character is perfect. Thomas does not change. Thomas is always the same. Thomas is the man who has always had the courage to admit what he did not know. Thomas is the man who has always had the courage to ask for an explanation when others pretended to understand. Thomas is the man who has always had the courage to say, "Let's die together," when others wanted to flee. And he is the same man who has the courage to say, "I need to see," when others accept without seeing. Spinoza, mapping all these appearances of Thomas in the texts, wrote an observation that became famous among scholars of the philosopher. He said that Thomas is the only character in the Gospels who demonstrates constantia animi, that is, constancy of spirit. The other apostles waver. Peter promises fidelity and denies. John is sweet but evasive. James fights for position. Matthew has zeal attacks. But Thomas is always Thomas. From the first phrase to the last, the Thomas who appears in the Gospels is the same man. Honest, lucid, courageous, willing to die for the truth, willing to doubt until he finds the truth. And it was this man, this specific man, who arrived on the 8th day. The house where the 11 were gathered was the same. The doors remained locked. The fear of the Jews, that is, the Jewish religious authorities who had ordered Jesus' arrest, had not diminished. On the contrary, rumors were circulating in Jerusalem that the body of the crucified had disappeared from the tomb. The high priests were furious. They were interrogating soldiers. They were suspecting the disciples. At any moment, someone could knock on that door and arrest everyone inside. Even so, the 11 remained there. They had nowhere to go. And perhaps deep down, all of them, even Thomas, were waiting for something to happen. It was Sunday again. A week after that appearance that divided the group between 10 believers and 1 doubter. The day was ending. The sun was beginning to set. Candles were being lit around the house. And the 11 were sitting around a low table, eating bread without much appetite, talking little, each lost in their own thoughts. It was then that it happened. Without warning, without sound, without the door opening. The figure appeared in their midst. Same hair, same beard, same tunic, same voice. "Peace be with you." The 10 turned, eyes wide, hands frozen in the air, as if they had been caught by surprise for the second time. Peter let the bread fall from his hand. John stood with his mouth open. Matthew, not knowing what to do, lowered his head by reflex. And Thomas. Thomas was sitting with his back to the point where the figure had appeared. Slowly, very slowly, with his heart racing in his chest, with his hands starting to tremble, he turned around. "This block is good for you." Block 5. Thomas saw. The other Gospels do not describe this scene. Only John, in chapter 20, verses 26 to 29, brings the account. And even so, he does so with an economy of words that borders on the brutal. John is the most mystical evangelist, the most lyrical, the most given to long theological speeches. But in this scene, in the most important moment of the encounter between the resurrected and the doubter, he becomes drier than ever, as if he were afraid of saying too much, as if he knew that this scene, if described in detail, could reveal things he preferred not to reveal. The scene, in its canonical form, is as follows. Jesus approaches Thomas, looks into his eyes, and says, in a tone of someone who was waiting exactly for that moment, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. And do not be unbelieving, but believing." Pause here for a moment. Do not rush through these words. Do not read them as if they were just another biblical quote among others. Read them as if it were the first time, as if you were in that room, as if you were Thomas. Jesus comes close to Thomas, not with anger, not with disappointment, not with that master's look that is going to scold. He comes offering his own body, offering his own wounds, offering the exact proof that Thomas had asked for 8 days earlier. How did Jesus know what Thomas had asked for? This is a question that no one asks, but it is one of the most important questions of this scene. The Gospels suggest that Jesus, after resurrecting, had supernatural knowledge of what the apostles had said in his absence. Fine, let's accept the suggestion, but even accepting, even assuming this omniscience, there is something extraordinarily significant in the fact that Jesus did not come to complain about Thomas, did not come to reprimand, did not come to condemn. He came to offer exactly what Thomas asked for, and he offered it in the same terms that Thomas had asked for, almost word for word. Thomas had said he needed to put his finger in the place of the nails. Jesus says, "Put your finger here." Thomas had said he needed to put his hand in the side. Jesus says, "Reach out your hand and put it in my side." There is a perfect symmetry. Thomas asked, Jesus grants. There is no discussion. There is no negotiation. There is only the direct and respectful fulfillment of a rational request. Spinoza, upon reaching this passage, made a note that deserves to be quoted in full. He wrote, in Latin, something like this: "Here resides a miracle greater than the resurrection. Here resides the recognition by Christ himself that doubt is not a sin, but a legitimate way to access the truth. The pastors who preach against Thomas preach against Christ himself." Read this again. The pastors who preach against Thomas preach against Christ himself. This sentence, if it had been published in his lifetime, would have cost Spinoza his life, not just once, but several times. That is why he kept it in his private notebooks. That is why it was only discovered posthumously. That is why for centuries priests and pastors preached just the opposite, as if Jesus had reprimanded Thomas, as if Thomas should have been stoned by his own brothers, as if doubt were the greatest offense against the sacred. But the text, read with clear eyes, shows exactly the opposite. The text shows Jesus going to Thomas. Jesus offering the wounds. Jesus giving the proof. Let's return to the scene. Thomas looks at Jesus, looks at the hands, looks at the side, looks into the eyes, and here happens the most astonishing thing in the entire passage, something that almost no one notices, almost no preacher mentions, almost no analysis makes a point of highlighting. Thomas does not touch. The text says that Jesus offered. It says that Jesus invited Thomas to put his finger, invited Thomas to put his hand. But the text does not say at any moment that Thomas actually did this. Thomas did not stick his finger in. Thomas did not stick his hand in. Thomas just looked and said a phrase, "My Lord and my God." This is the highest phrase of faith in all the Gospels. There is no other phrase in the 4 canonical Gospels where any apostle addresses Jesus calling him "my God." Peter never said this. John never said this. Neither Matthew, nor Mark, nor Luke record any other apostle explicitly confessing the divinity of Christ in such direct terms. The only confession of the divinity of Jesus, in the first person, directed to Jesus himself, in all the Gospels comes from the lips of Thomas, the supposed unbeliever, the supposed doubter, the supposed worst of the apostles. Spinoza, upon noticing this, was so impacted that he wrote the same observation 3 times in different notebooks, as if he wanted to make sure that that perception would not be lost. The observation is simple and devastating. Thomas did not touch. Thomas did not need to touch. At the moment, Jesus offered himself, opened his tunic, showed the wounds, looked into Thomas's eyes. Thomas understood that he was in front of what he had loved for 3 years. And he understood without needing to stick his finger in. He understood without needing to verify. He understood by the only legitimate form of understanding that exists between 2 human beings, the mutual recognition, eye to eye, of the reality of the other. And it was at that instant that Thomas made the greatest profession of faith in the history of Christianity. See the complete sequence then. Thomas asked for proof. Jesus offered proof. Thomas did not take the proof. Thomas believed before touching, and his faith, precisely because it was preceded by the honest demand for proof, is a qualitatively different faith from that of the other 10. The others believed because they had seen without asking. Thomas believed because he had seen after asking. But what Thomas believed in the end was much deeper than what the others believed. The others believed that the Master had returned. Thomas believed that the Master was God. This difference is staggering. The 10 confessed the resurrection of a man they loved. Thomas confessed the divinity of a being he had known as a man for 3 years. The 10 saw a miracle. Thomas saw a theophany. The 10 were joyful. Thomas was terrified, because recognizing God before oneself, in the flesh, with nails in his hands, is an infinitely more disturbing experience than recognizing a dead friend who returned. And then comes the final phrase of that scene, a phrase that for 2,000 years has been misinterpreted, a phrase that needs to be read very carefully. Jesus says to Thomas, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." There it is. For all intents and purposes of official preaching, this phrase closes the discussion. Thomas is placed in the background. Those who believe without seeing are exalted. Doubt is supposedly condemned as inferior. Preachers have been hammering this point for centuries. They show this phrase as proof that faith without evidence is superior to faith with evidence, and that Thomas, although received by Jesus with patience, is in the end an example of inferior faith. But Spinoza read this phrase differently. He realized, with that precision of a philosopher trained in medieval logic, that the phrase can be read in 2 radically different ways. One of them, the traditional reading, transforms the phrase into an implicit condemnation of Thomas. The other reading, subtler but more coherent with the rest of the Gospels, transforms the phrase into a descriptive, not normative observation. Jesus is saying that there are 2 paths to faith: the path of vision, which is the path of the apostles, and the path of belief without vision, which is the path of those who would come later. And both are blessed. The difference between one reading and the other is abyssal. In the first reading, Thomas is the inferior. In the second, Thomas is the beginning of a lineage. In the first, doubt is a flaw. In the second, doubt is the natural starting point of those who have not seen. In the first, faith and reason are opposites. In the second, faith can be rational, although it does not always need to be rational. Spinoza defended the second reading with all his might, and argued that the first reading, which was the official reading of the Church in his time, was an ideological distortion produced over the centuries by an institution that needed to control the faithful, and that to control the faithful needed to discourage independent investigation of the truth. In other words, the traditional reading of Thomas did not arise from the text. It arose from the political need of churches to produce obedient believers. And it was for saying this, precisely for saying this, that Spinoza was expelled from his synagogue in 1656. And it is about what happened in that synagogue on that day that we need to talk now. July 27th, 1656, Amsterdam. The city had been built on wooden piles driven into the mud. It was an impossible city, built on the impossible, sustained in the impossible by a population that had decided, generation after generation, to stand firm on soil that could not support a foot. And this improbable city, throughout the 17th century, had transformed into the nerve center of the world economy. Ships departed from the ports of Amsterdam to Java, to the West Indies, to the coast of Africa. Merchants from all nations crossed paths on the bridges over the canals, and among these nations there was one especially welcomed, one especially protected by the Dutch burgomasters. The Jews, not the Jews in general, the Sephardic Jews, descendants of those who had been expelled from Spain in 1492 and from Portugal shortly thereafter. These Jews had traveled through Europe for over a century, persecuted, hidden, pretending to be Christians where they needed to pretend, keeping their faith secret in the cellars of their homes. And when finally Amsterdam, in the early 17th century, opened its doors to them, guaranteeing protection in exchange for discretion, these Jews arrived with something precious: accumulated wealth, sprawling trade networks, knowledge of several languages, but they also arrived with something dangerous: trauma, fear, the absolute need to never again attract the attention of Christian authorities. It was in this context that Baruch Spinoza was born in 1632. His father, Miguel, was a prosperous trader of dried fruits and olive oil. His mother, Hannah Deborah, was Miguel's second wife, as the first had died young. Hannah would also die young, when Baruch was only 6 years old. The boy grew up in a house marked by early deaths. One of his sisters died, one of his brothers died, the stepmother died. The father held on until 1654, when Baruch was 21, but then he also died. At 22, Baruch was a complete orphan. He had only one sister alive, Rebecca, with whom he had to enter into a legal dispute over the inheritance. He won the fight, but later, in a gesture that reveals much about his character, he gave up almost everything, keeping only his father's bed. He said that money was not important. Spinoza had been educated in the Jewish school of the community, the Talmud Torah. He was a brilliant student. He learned Hebrew, Aramaic, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, Latin. He read Tanakh, Talmud, Mishnah, medieval commentaries. The rabbis of the community, especially the famous Saul Levi Mortera, saw in him a future great rabbi, perhaps the greatest of the century, perhaps the intellectual heir of Maimonides himself. But Baruch began to read other things. Here it is important to understand the context. In Amsterdam at that time, it was prohibited by Christian authorities for Jews to circulate freely among Christian intellectuals. But the prohibition existed more on paper than in practice. Spinoza began to attend the school of Frans van den Enden, a former Dutch Jesuit who had broken with the Society of Jesus and who ran a kind of private school in Amsterdam where Latin was taught, but where philosophy, politics, and science were also freely discussed. Van den Enden was a free thinker. He had read Descartes, Bacon, Galileo, the French libertine authors, ancient materialists like Lucretius and Epicurus. And Spinoza, a young Jew with a prodigious mind, dove into this library like a fish that finally finds the ocean. It was in this phase that Spinoza began to do something dangerous. He began to compare what was written in the Torah with what the Greek philosophers said, to compare what the rabbis said with what Descartes said, to compare what the Christian priests preached with what the Protestant pastors preached. And in comparing, he began to see things that no one before him had had the courage to articulate publicly. He saw, for example, that the Gospels do not agree with each other on many important points, that the story of Jesus' resurrection appears in 4 different forms, and that these differences are not small. He saw that the Torah, supposedly written by Moses, contains passages that could not have been written by Moses, such as the description of Moses' own death and burial. He saw that the prophets, read carefully, contradict each other. He saw that the concept of God presented by the priests was an anthropomorphic, childish concept, unworthy of the true God. And he saw, above all, that the interpretation that organized religions made of their own texts was a political interpretation, aimed at controlling the faithful, and not an intellectually honest interpretation. And all of this he began to say out loud, first among friends, then among acquaintances, then in the streets, finally within the synagogue itself. The Jewish community of Amsterdam was alarmed, not for purely theological reasons. The rabbis were not fanatics. Many of them had themselves read Descartes in secret, knew the internal contradictions of the sacred texts, were aware of the exegetical problems. What frightened the rabbis was something else. It was the memory of the Inquisition. It was the fear that if the Jews of Amsterdam gained a reputation for encouraging free religious thought, the Calvinist burgomasters, who still tolerated the Jewish presence in the city, might withdraw their protection, and the Jews, who had just found shelter after 150 years of wandering, could be expelled again. It was a matter of the community's survival. It was a matter of historical pragmatism. Spinoza, with his dizzying mind and his mouth unable to pretend, was a threat to the very existence of the community that had raised him. The rabbis tried to convince him. Saul Levi Mortera, his former teacher, cried before him. He pleaded, begged, even offered money for him to moderate his speech. 1,000 florins a year, some reports say, for Baruch to continue attending the synagogue and remain silent. 1,000 florins at the time was a fortune. Spinoza earned later, with his work as a lens polisher, perhaps 100 florins a year. But he refused. Not out of pride. He refused because he knew that if he accepted, he would be doing exactly what he had learned to despise in the Christians of the Inquisition. He would be a Marano of his own synagogue. He would be pretending to believe while disbelieving. He would be choosing material comfort in exchange for intellectual silence. For Spinoza, this was not an option. Not because he was heroic, not because he wanted to be a martyr, but because he had understood by studying Thomas, by studying Socrates, by studying Maimonides, that the only life worth living is the life in which thought and speech are aligned. To lie about what one thinks is a form of inner death, and Spinoza did not want to die that way. When the rabbis realized there was no turning back, they decided to convene the assembly. On July 27, 1656, the Talmud Torah synagogue was packed. Men dressed in their finest clothes, women behind curtains, elders with their scrolls of parchment. People who had seen Baruch grow up. People who had known his father. People who had celebrated his bar mitzvah years before. They were all there, and they all knew why they had been summoned. The elders ascended to the pulpit. In Latin and Hebrew they read the document. It was not an improvised document. It was a carefully prepared document, based on medieval formulas of excommunication, using some of the most terrible words of the rabbinic tradition. The candles of the pulpit were lit with a special wick. By custom, during the reading of the Sherem, the candles melted slowly, and when the reading ended, the candles would be turned upside down and extinguished on the synagogue floor as a sign that the excommunicated was now out of the light of the community, out of the light of God, out of the light of life. The reading began, and here I will give you the exact words because they need to be heard at least once in this story, in all their brutality. With the judgment of the angels and the decree of the saints, with the consent of the blessed Lord, and with the consent of this entire sacred congregation in the presence of the holy books, with 613 precepts that are written therein, we anathematize, separate, curse, and expel Baruch Spinoza, with the anathema with which Joshua anathematized Jericho, with the curse with which Elisha cursed the boys, and with all the curses written in the law. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when lying down, and cursed be he when rising up. Cursed be he when going out, and cursed be he when entering. The Lord will not forgive him. The anger of the Lord and his zeal will be kindled against this man, and all the curses written in this book will fall upon him. And the Lord will blot out his name from under heaven, and will separate him for evil from all the tribes of Israel, with all the curses of the firmament written in the book of this law. And you, who cling to the Lord your God, are all alive today. We order that no one communicate with him orally or in writing, that no one render him any favor, that no one dwell with him under the same roof, that no one approach him within 4 cubits of distance, and that no one read anything written or dictated by him. 23 years. That was his age. 23 years to receive a curse of that magnitude. 23 years to hear, pronounced aloud in front of the entire community, that his very name would be blotted out from under heaven. 23 years to become, in a single day, a man without family, without religion, without people, without community, without friends, without a recognized future. Spinoza received the news at home. He was not in the synagogue. Reports suggest that he had already been informed not to attend. When someone knocked on his door and told him what had happened, he simply listened in silence. He did not cry. He did not scream. He did not run to plead for forgiveness. He simply, according to later reports, sat on the edge of his father's bed, the only thing he had inherited, and stared at the floor for a long time. Then he got up, gathered his books, and left. He left for a life that no one before him had lived. He left for a crossing that even today, 3.5 centuries later, leaves any philosophy student stunned when discovering the details. But before we continue with him, I want to remind you of one thing. I want you to keep an image in your mind. The image of a 23-year-old boy, thin with olive skin, large dark eyes, leaving a house in Vluyenburg with a bundle of books under his arm, not knowing where to go, with no one to call his own, in the full summer of 1656. This boy is Thomas. It is exactly Thomas, not metaphorically, not symbolically. Thomas, the same Thomas who 16 centuries earlier had refused to accept the official version of 10 collapsing men. The same Thomas who had demanded to see with his own eyes. The same Thomas who had been punished by history for that demand. This Thomas was back. In a cold city in northern Europe, carrying books instead of a tunic, speaking Dutch instead of Aramaic. But he was the same man, the same soul, the same divine stubbornness of not accepting any truth that had not passed through the sieve of reason, and he was now completely alone. The first months after the excommunication were the most difficult months of Spinoza's life. You need to understand what a cherem is in practice. It is not just a religious punishment, it is a total social punishment. It means that your mother, if she were still alive, would be prohibited from speaking to you. It means that your uncles, cousins, childhood acquaintances will cross the street when they see you coming. It means that the Jewish butcher will no longer sell you kosher meat. The Jewish baker will not sell you bread. The Jewish tailor will not mend your clothes. You who grew up entirely within that closed community, who learned the language of that community, who have all your ties in that community, cease to exist socially overnight. Worse, your sister Rebecca, who had fought with you over the inheritance a few months earlier, is now officially prohibited from approaching you. The friends you had in the Talmudic school, the classmates with whom you studied Hebrew for years, all of them are instructed to pretend that you never existed. Spinoza tried in the first days to return to the house where he had lived his whole life. The house was technically his, but the neighborhood was Jewish. The merchants on the street were Jewish, the people walking on the sidewalk were Jewish. And all of them, had received the express order not to approach Baruch within 4 cubits, that is, about 2 meters. Imagine the daily life. You leave home to buy bread and the vendor looks the other way. You want to greet a woman you have known since childhood, and she quickens her pace. You want to enter a store where you used to go every day and the owner shuts the door in your face. And all this silence, all this emptiness, happens without violence, without aggression, without offensive words, just with the icy indifference of those who have been instructed not to recognize you as a person anymore. There is a report that on one of those first days, Spinoza was attacked by a fanatic on the stairs of the municipal theater. A more excitable Jew, who considered the excommunication insufficient, decided to act on his own. He waited for Spinoza to leave a lecture, drew a dagger, and tried to stab him. Spinoza, who had learned to wear a heavy Spanish-style cloak, took the stab in the mantle. The blade tore the fabric, but did not reach his body. Spinoza kept that torn cloak for the rest of his life. When asked why he kept it, he replied that it was to remind him every day of what can happen to those who dare to think freely. Spinoza left Amsterdam. He was not officially exiled. The burgomasters of the city respected the autonomy of the Jewish community in religious matters, but they did not force an excommunicated person to leave the city. It was Spinoza who decided to leave. He decided out of a survival instinct. He decided because he knew that if he stayed, sooner or later some fanatic would manage to bring the knife to his heart. He moved to Rheinsberg, a small town near Leiden, where there was a community of heterodox Christians called Collegianten. They were people who had rejected both Catholicism and official Calvinism, who gathered to read the Bible without clergy, who advocated freedom of conscience, who lived simply. It was among them that Spinoza found his first true friends after the excommunication, people who did not care that he was Jewish, who did not care about the curse, who just wanted to get to know that brilliant young man who had been expelled from his own community for daring to think too much. It was also in Rheinsberg that Spinoza began to work professionally as a lens polisher. Here I need to pause a bit, because no one has told you properly what this means. Polishing lenses in the 17th century was not a peaceful profession. It was a lethal profession. You took blocks of raw glass, rubbed them on abrasive surfaces, slowly, for hours, days, weeks, until you obtained the exact curvature. This process generated a very fine silica dust, a nearly invisible white powder that hung in the air of the workshop and was inhaled with every breath. The lungs of those who polished lenses filled with this dust, microscopically, slowly, inexorably. Today we know the name of this disease, silicosis. Today we know that silicosis is incurable, that it destroys lung tissue to the point where the person simply can no longer breathe. In the 17th century, no one knew this. Spinoza polished lenses because it was a clean profession, in the moral sense. It did not involve trade. It did not involve interest. It did not involve things he considered degrading. And he did not know that he was slowly killing himself every time he breathed in his own workshop. And yet, he preferred to polish lenses than to accept patronage or pensions from princes that could compromise his intellectual freedom. When the elector of the Palatinate offered him a chair in Heidelberg, with a generous salary, with a promise of academic freedom, Spinoza refused. He said in the response letter that accepting the chair would mean, even if indirectly, having to moderate his thinking so as not to shock the sponsors, and he was not willing to moderate anything. So the lenses continued, and the lungs continued to fill with dust. It was in Rheinsberg and then in Voorburg and then in The Hague that Spinoza wrote the texts that would change the history of Western philosophy. But the text that particularly interests us in this story, the text where he develops his complete reading of Thomas, is the Theological Political Treatise, published in 1670, 14 years after the excommunication. The book was published without the author's name. It was published with a false editorial address, stating that it had been printed in Hamburg, when in fact it had been printed in Amsterdam. Spinoza knew that signing that book was signing his own death warrant, but all the European intellectuals of the time discovered within a few months who the author was, and the effect was devastating. The book was banned in the Netherlands. It was banned in Germany. It was banned in France. It was placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum of the Catholic Church, the official list of books that no Catholic could read under penalty of mortal sin. The Calvinist authorities of the Netherlands issued a proclamation stating that the book was a work forged in hell by an apostate Jew and a diabolical philosopher. Pastors climbed to the pulpits in Rotterdam, Utrecht, and Leiden, denouncing the book weekly. University students were prohibited from reading it. Libraries were inspected to confirm that the book was not circulating. And yet, secretly, under false covers, with clandestine editions, the book circulated. It passed from hand to hand. It was read in secret in the boarding rooms of theology students in Marburg and Halle. It was read in literary clubs in London. It was read by Voltaire, still young, in the library of some discreet friend. It was read by Diderot, by Lessing, by Goethe, and it was planting in each reader a little seed that would grow, centuries later, into what we now call modernity. In chapter 5 of the treatise, Spinoza speaks directly about miracles. He makes a fundamental distinction. He says that there is a difference between the miracle as an event and the miracle as a narrative. The event, if it happened, was a natural event. It may have seemed supernatural to the eyes of those who saw it, but being natural, it could, in principle, be explained by the laws of nature. The narrative, on the other hand, is always a posterior interpretation of the event, told by men, written by men, transmitted by men, and therefore always subject to the limitations of men. In other words, when the Gospels say that Jesus suddenly appeared in a room with the doors locked, they are making a narrative. This narrative was written decades after the event. It was written by men who were not present. It was written based on oral accounts that had passed through dozens of mouths. And it was written with theological intent, that is, with the aim of demonstrating a spiritual truth, not with the aim of producing a modern historiographical account. This does not mean, and Spinoza is careful here, that the original event did not happen. It simply means that between the event and the narrative there is a distance, and that this distance needs to be respected by any honest reader. And here comes Thomas. Spinoza says that Thomas, within the text itself, is the only character who respects this distance. The other 10 accept the narrative as if it were the event. Thomas knows that there is an abyss between one and the other, and Thomas demands that before accepting the narrative, he may see the original event with his own eyes. This is the fundamental operation of modern philosophy. This is, in essence, the operation that would found modern science. This is the operation that separates the Middle Ages from the modern age. This is the operation that Galileo did with Aristotle, that Descartes did with scholasticism, that Newton did with the alchemical tradition, to separate the event from the narrative, to suspend judgment, to demand evidence. And this operation Thomas did first, in the 1st century, in a closed room in Jerusalem. Spinoza, realizing this, wrote a passage that still today, when you read it in the original Latin, gives chills. He said, more or less, what the philosophers of our time are discovering with such effort, a fisherman from Galilee had already discovered over 1,600 years ago. But his discovery was suffocated by the church that was built on the shoulders of other apostles. It is up to us now to restore to Thomas the glory that is due to him. Restore to Thomas the glory that is due to him. Read it again. Restore to Thomas the glory that is due to him. This phrase alone justifies Spinoza's entire life, not because it is his deepest phrase. There are other phrases much deeper, but because it demonstrates the secret engine of Spinoza's philosophical project. Spinoza was not writing abstract philosophy. Spinoza was fighting a historical battle, a battle against 2,000 years of organized defamation of a man who had had courage. And this battle he fought alone, in a small town in northern Europe, polishing lenses during the day, writing at night, coughing more and more, without family, without community, without money, without public recognition in life, and he won. Today, no one with serious training in philosophy can discuss Thomas without going through Spinoza, and no one with serious training in theology can sustain the old version of Thomas as an example of weakness anymore. Spinoza's victory, posthumous like all great philosophical victories, was total, but to reach that victory, he had to pay an immense price. And it is about that price, about what it cost Spinoza to save the memory of Thomas, that we need to talk now. The price was loneliness, not the romantic loneliness of the poet in the room, not the chosen loneliness of the monk in the monastery. It was a different kind of loneliness, an imposed loneliness, a structural loneliness created by a society that had decided in chorus that that man no longer existed. Spinoza lived in rented rooms, always rooms, never a house of his own, never a family around, never children, never a wife. There are indications in letters and later accounts that he fell in love once, in his youth, with a young woman named Clara Maria, the daughter of his Latin teacher, van den Enden. But Clara Maria preferred another suitor, a more conventional man, more predictable, with more stable prospects. Spinoza never tried again. He never sought another romance. He was never seen in the intimate company of any woman for the rest of his life. The accounts of his landlords, over the 20 years following his excommunication, all described the same pattern. Spinoza woke up early. He had breakfast alone in his room. He worked on lenses in the morning. He had something simple for lunch, usually oatmeal soup, porridge with butter, sometimes an egg. He returned to work. In the afternoon, he read. In the evening, he wrote. He slept little. He almost never received visitors. When he did, it was always the same small group of friends. Philosophers, heterodox theologians, curious doctors, some German nobles who came to meet the philosopher of The Hague, as if he were a rare attraction. He was polite to everyone, he smiled, he conversed, but he kept his distance. He never spoke of himself. He never told childhood stories. He never mentioned family. He never cried in public nor complained in private. When someone asked if he missed his loved ones, he changed the subject. When someone asked if the excommunication still hurt after so many years, he said he no longer thought about it. But he did think. The private notebooks, which were only published long after his death, show that he thought a lot, almost obsessively. There are entire pages dedicated to understanding the phenomenon of social exclusion. There are meticulous analyses of the psychological mechanisms by which a human group transforms an individual into a pariah. There are even passages where he tries to rationally justify what happened, as if he wanted to forgive the rabbis of his childhood. But there are also passages, rarer, more intimate, where the wound appears. A famous note, written around 1670, simply says in Latin, "Vivere sine amico est mors animae." To live without a friend is the death of the soul. Spinoza had friends, but they were friends who knew, and he knew too, that their friendship had limits. They could visit him, they could discuss philosophy, they could even host him in their homes for short periods. But they could not publicly associate with him. They could not publicly defend his books. They could not admit in the social circles they frequented that they read Spinoza with pleasure. It was a secret friendship, a clandestine friendship, a friendship that always happened in half-light, in closed rooms, with care. And it was living like this, in this half-world of dim light, that Spinoza developed his most radical thoughts on faith, on Thomas, on God. Because what he realized, upon rereading the Gospels for the umpteenth time, was something that no one before him had articulated so clearly. He realized that the concept of faith, propagated by the official churches, was a complete distortion of the original concept of faith that appears in the sacred texts. For the official churches, faith meant accepting as true what the priest taught without questioning. For Spinoza, reading the text with clear eyes, original faith meant something radically different. Faith meant trust. Trust in someone or something based on experience and reason, not on submission. When Abraham has faith in God, in the biblical text, it is not because some priest told him to have faith. It is because Abraham had direct personal experiences with what he called God. When the prophets have faith in their mission, it is because they felt an inner voice calling them. When, centuries later, Thomas ends up having faith, it is because he saw the resurrected one with his own eyes. In all cases, at the origin of the texts, faith is a response to an experience. It is not a submission to authority. It is not an acceptance of a narrative. It is a response to an encounter. And what the churches did over the centuries was completely invert this concept. They transformed the original faith, which was active, which was investigative, which was personal, into a passive, dogmatic institutional faith. They asked the faithful to have faith without experience, to accept without encountering, to submit without investigating. And this inversion, Spinoza argues, is the greatest spiritual tragedy in Western history, because by asking for faith without experience, the churches formed billions of Christians who live from childhood to old age repeating dogmas without ever having had the equivalent of Thomas's encounter with the resurrected one. And this faith without encounter, this inherited faith, this faith received through catechesis and not through experience, is not faith in the original sense. It is something else. It is habit. It is conformity. It is fear of not belonging to the group. But it is not faith. And here Spinoza takes a step that many people over the centuries found too bold. He says that faith without encounter, the faith that the churches sell as the supreme virtue, is actually a sophisticated form of servitude. The faithful who pride themselves on their blind faith, who boast of believing without having seen, who look at Thomas with moral superiority, are not being religious. They are being servants, servants of institutions that need obedience, servants of pastors who live off the tithe, servants of priests who depend on the submission of their parishioners. True faith, Spinoza says, does not come down from above. It rises from within. It does not come from authority. It comes from experience. It does not ask for submission. It asks for investigation. It does not reward those who accept without seeing. It rewards those who seek until they find. And the one who understood this first in the history of Christianity was Thomas. Think about this arc. The great philosopher of the 17th century, after 20 years of voluntary exile, after polishing lenses until his lungs failed, after reading everything that had been written in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, Italian, French, Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese, after thinking 16 hours a day throughout his adult life, comes to the following conclusion. The most authentic faith of the New Testament is Thomas's faith. Not the faith of the other 10, not the faith of Peter, not the faith of John, the faith of Thomas. And this conclusion, although he wrote it in books that circulated throughout Europe, although it was read by successive generations of intellectuals, never reached ordinary people. It was never preached from any pulpit. It was never taught in any catechesis. The churches had too much interest in keeping Thomas in the position of a negative example. It was impossible for an institution that depended on obedience to admit that the true model of faith was a man who dared to ask for proof. So Spinoza's truth remained locked in expensive books, read by few, cited from afar. And the people continued to hear, week after week, that Thomas was the doubter, that Thomas was of little faith, that being like Thomas was a sin. Spinoza knew this would happen. He knew that his victory, if it came, would come slowly. He knew that each generation has a small handful of people who manage to free themselves from the official narratives, and that his mission was to write for that handful. It was to write for the next generations of Thomases. It was to plant seeds in soil that he would never see bloom, and it was by writing like this, with this awareness of the long wait, with this cosmic patience, that he composed his deepest works. The theological political treatise, the ethics, the political treatise which remained unfinished, the letters, the notebooks. In February 1677, he could barely breathe anymore. The landlady of the house in The Hague, a woman named Hendrik van der Spyk, described in her later testimonies that, in the last months, Spinoza was continuously coughing, that there were nights when he could not sleep, sitting up in bed, leaning against 3 pillows, trying to pull air through lungs already almost completely compromised by silicosis. But even in those final months he continued working, polishing lenses in the morning, writing letters and the political treatise in the afternoon, talking with the few friends who came to visit him in the late afternoons. On February 21st, 1677, he woke up a little more cheerful. He asked for chicken soup. He ate the soup slowly, with pleasure. He chatted a bit with the landlady about trivial things. In the afternoon he received a visit from his friend, the Dr. Lodewijk Meyer, who had come from Amsterdam especially to see him. Spinoza asked the landlady to leave the room so he could speak privately with the doctor. They talked for a few hours. What was said in that room, no one knew exactly. The doctor left afterward with tears in his eyes, but refused to give details. Perhaps Spinoza asked Meyer to take care of his manuscripts. Perhaps he asked him to destroy certain letters that should not come to light. Perhaps they simply talked, like 2 old friends, about philosophy, about life, about death. At night, Spinoza asked Hendrik to return to the room. He said he was tired. He asked her to extinguish the candle. And he said that final phrase I mentioned in the introduction to this story. The truth does not hurt. What hurts is the fear of the truth. He closed his eyes. He fell asleep, and he never woke up again. He was 44 years old. He died alone, without family, without an official religion, without anyone that night praying a prayer by his bedside. He died as he had lived, like Thomas, like the twin of a humanity that had not yet learned to listen to him. But the story did not end with his death. On the contrary, the story only truly began afterward. What happened in the weeks following Spinoza's death is a story that seems like a movie script. Hendrik van der Spyk, the landlady, knew that there was something precious in that room. Spinoza had left clear instructions with his closest friends. Right after his death, before any civil or religious authority could interfere, it was necessary to collect the philosopher's desk, put it on a boat and secretly send it to Amsterdam. And that is exactly what happened. 4 days after the death, a simple cart stopped in front of the house. 2 men, friends of Spinoza, silently carried the desk. There was no ceremonial coffin. There was no rabbi. There was no priest. Just a dark wooden desk being carried by discreet men through the cold streets of The Hague to the port. From there, on a riverboat, the desk travelled through the canals to Amsterdam. There it was received at the home of the friend Jan Ruwerts, a bookseller and clandestine publisher, known for publishing works considered too dangerous by all the other publishers in the city. Ruwerts opened the desk, and what he found inside changed the history of Western philosophy forever. Manuscripts, hundreds of pages, in Latin, in Dutch, in Hebrew, letters to disciples scattered across Europe, notes on the Gospels, drafts of treatises. And at the center of it all, bound in simple leather, the manuscript of a work that Spinoza had worked on for 12 years of his life without ever daring to publish. The Ethics, demonstrated in the manner of geometers. It was a strange title. It was a strange book, written as if it were a geometry manual by Euclid, with definitions, axioms, propositions, demonstrations, corollaries, as if human morality, the nature of God, the structure of reality, could be deduced with the same cold precision with which the Pythagorean theorem is demonstrated. Ruwerts read. It took him weeks to read everything, and he realized that he had in his hands the most dangerous work ever produced in modern Europe. Because within that book, Spinoza did something that no one before him had done. He eliminated the separation between God and nature. He said that God and nature are the same thing, seen from different angles, that everything that exists is a single infinite eternal substance of which we are merely transient modes, that there is no creator separate from creation, because creation is the creator itself expressing itself, that there are no miracles in the old sense, because everything that happens according to the necessary laws of that single substance. This was heresy in all known religions, in all of them. Without exception, for Orthodox Jews it was idolatry, because it confused God with the world. For Catholics it was pantheism, condemned for centuries. For Calvinists, it was atheism disguised as philosophy. For Muslims, it would be blasphemy. For Lutheran pastors, it would be the work of the devil. There was not a single European religious tradition that could accept that book without having to completely reformulate itself. Ruwerts hesitated. He thought about destroying the manuscript to protect himself, but he couldn't. He knew he was facing a historic moment. He knew that Spinoza had died to write that. He knew that destroying that text would be betraying the dead friend and also betraying the truth. In December 1677, 10 months after the philosopher's death, Ruwerts published the Ethics, anonymously, without an author's name on the cover. Just with the Latin indication BDS Opera Posthuma, the initials hid the full name. But every European intellectual knew. Within 2 months, the book was banned in almost all countries in Europe. Within 3 months, it was being read in secret by all the philosophers in Europe. And that is how the long, slow, inevitable posthumous revenge of Baruch Spinoza began. The revenge was not violent. It was not angry. It was not a toppling of churches. It was something else. It was a silent infiltration. The book passed from hand to hand. Students copied excerpts at night. Professors cited it without mentioning the source. Liberal pastors began to use Spinozist arguments without knowing they were using them. And little by little, page by page, generation by generation, the ideas of that excommunicated Jew began to infiltrate the mental fabric of modern Europe. 100 years later in Germany, the philosopher Gotthold Lessing would tell a friend in secret, "There is no other philosophy but that of Spinoza." And the friend, scandalized, would leak this confession, generating a controversy that would shake all of Europe. 200 years later in England, the poet Coleridge would confess in private diaries that he had found in Spinoza a spiritual comfort that no church had ever offered him. 300 years later in Switzerland, a young physicist named Albert Einstein, when asked if he believed in God, would respond with a famous phrase, "I believe in the God of Spinoza." The seed planted in a basement in The Hague had germinated, and Thomas slowly was beginning to be liberated. To understand why the Ethics restores Thomas's dignity, it is necessary to understand the philosophical heart of the book. And the philosophical heart of the book is a single idea, simple, devastating. God is not a person. Think about that slowly. The entire Western religious tradition, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, had been painting God as a kind of celestial monarch, a being with will, with humor, with preferences, with jealousy, with anger, with love, a being that creates, that punishes, that rewards, that forgives, a being, ultimately, with human characteristics amplified to infinity. The theologians called this anthropomorphism. They recognized that it was a problem, but they continued to describe God this way because it was the only way that people could understand. Spinoza said no. He said that this anthropomorphic God, this personal God, this biblical God, was a projection of human imagination. It was what men did when they needed to explain the universe before science. But the true God, he said, is infinitely greater, infinitely more impersonal, infinitely less sentimental. The true God is the totality of what exists. It is the single substance that manifests in everything. It is the internal law of the universe that makes the stars shine, that makes plants grow, that makes hearts beat, that makes thoughts think. God in Spinoza is the very being of all that is. It is not outside the world. It is being the world. And here Thomas comes in again, because if God is not a person, if God does not have a capricious will, if God does not suspend the laws of nature to perform occasional miracles, then what happened in that room in Jerusalem needs to be understood differently. The appearance of the resurrected one, according to Spinoza, cannot have been a break in the laws of nature, because God does not break his own laws. It was, then, either an extraordinary natural event that the apostles interpreted religiously, or it was an internal spiritual experience that the 10 experienced collectively. In either case, Thomas was right to ask for verification. If it was a natural event, verification was possible and legitimate. If it was an internal experience, then trying to replicate the experience was the only way to test its reality. In both cases, Thomas's stance was not of spiritual weakness, it was of ontological coherence. And more, Spinoza goes further. He says that Jesus himself, by offering for Thomas to touch, is confirming this. He is saying, with a silent gesture, that true faith does not ask for blind submission. It asks for loving verification. That the resurrected one is not afraid of scrutiny. On the contrary, he invites scrutiny. Because the truth does not hurt. What hurts is the fear of the truth. See how everything fits together. The Spinozist theology, the Thomistic epistemology, Spinoza's final phrase on his deathbed. Everything points to the same conclusion. The religion that is based on the prohibition of questioning is a religion that is afraid of itself. True religion, true faith, true relationship with the sacred invites questioning. It welcomes doubt. It offers wounds to be touched. When this idea began to circulate through Europe in the following centuries, it had a predictable effect. The official theologians were furious, but sensitive intellectuals felt relief. For the first time in centuries, someone was saying out loud that it was possible to have a deep spiritual life without having to abdicate reason. It was possible to love God without having to believe in absurd things. It was possible to be religious without being naive. And this intellectual liberation, slow, secret, began to spread. When Voltaire, in the 18th century, fiercely attacked the Catholic Church in his polemical works, he was using Spinozist weapons, although he did not always admit it. When the German Enlightenment movement tried to separate faith from superstition, it was drinking from the Spinozist source. When, 2 centuries later, modern theologians began to reread the Gospels with a historical critical method, separating event from narrative, investigating the editorial layers of the texts, they were practically doing what Spinoza had proposed 300 years earlier. And Thomas, little by little, was being placed back in the position he should have always occupied, not as an example of weakness, but as a precursor of a mature, rational, courageous form of spirituality, as the first in a lineage that would go from Galileo to Einstein, from Socrates to Hannah Arendt, from Maimonides to Spinoza, from Erasmus to Simone Weil, the lineage of those who refuse to separate the heart from the head, the lineage of those who love the truth more than they love the comfort of certainty. You at this moment, listening to this story, are in that lineage. Perhaps you didn't even know it. Perhaps you never thought about it. But the simple fact that you have come this far, that you have resisted the impulse to close this video in the first minutes, that you have accepted to walk with me through these difficult reflections, places you in that lineage. You are unknowingly one of Thomas's spiritual children, one of Spinoza's heirs, one of those who refuse, deep down in their soul, the intellectual humiliation of pretending to believe what they do not believe, and this in itself is already a form of prayer. Block 11. The intellectual history of the 3 centuries following Spinoza's death can be told in a way as the story of Thomas's slow revenge. At first, no one dared to admit it publicly. Those who read Spinoza did so in secret, in closed rooms with curtains drawn. Those who quoted Spinoza generally pretended to be attacking him so as not to be confused with him. University libraries kept the ethics on special shelves, accessible only to authorized professors. Theology students caught reading the book were expelled without the right to defend themselves. But the ideas leaked out. Like water through porous rock, they found their way. In 1785, in Germany, what became known as the Pantheismus Streit, the pantheism controversy erupted. It all began when the philosopher Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi revealed to the public a confidence that the old playwright Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, recently deceased, had made to him years earlier. Lessing, considered the greatest German intellectual of his time, had secretly said that he considered himself a Spinozist, that he believed in no other God but the God of Spinoza. The confession scandalized Germany. How could it be? Lessing, the respectable Lessing, the author of Nathan the Wise, secretly a follower of that cursed Jew from Amsterdam. It was an intellectual bombshell. Goethe got involved, Herder got involved, Mendelssohn got involved, and while theologians and pastors tore their garments in public horror, a new generation of young readers rushed to the libraries in search of those forbidden books, wanting to discover, on their own, what had been so powerful as to win over the greatest intellectual of the nation. Clandestine reading became a fever, and soon it became tradition. In the 19th century, Spinoza was studied openly at German universities. Hegel built much of his system in dialogue with him. Schopenhauer, although he disagreed on many points, recognized his greatness. Nietzsche, in a famous moment, wrote to his friend Overbeck saying that he had discovered Spinoza too late in life, and that had he known him earlier, he would have been a completely different thinker. Marx read Spinoza attentively and took from him ideas about the critique of religion as a historical product. Freud read Spinoza and took from him the notion that human passions are mechanical forces that need to be understood, not condemned. And as for Thomas, in parallel, theology was slowly changing. In 1859, in Germany, a work was published that would change everything. David Friedrich Strauss wrote The Life of Jesus, critically examined. Strauss applied to the Gospels exactly the method that Spinoza had proposed 200 years earlier. He separated what was historical document from what was theological myth. He showed that the narratives of the Gospels were later literary constructions, and when he reached the scenes of the resurrected's appearances, he argued with meticulous reasoning that Thomas had been the only apostle to behave rationally. The book was banned. Strauss lost his chair. He was expelled from the university. But the book circulated, and in England, translated by Mary Ann Evans, the future writer George Eliot, it reached an entire generation of English readers, including, it is said, the young Charles Darwin, who was beginning to write on the origin of species. Do you see the fabric forming? Spinoza in the 17th century, Strauss in the 19th, Darwin shortly after, Einstein in the 20th century, all each in their own way, doing the same basic operation. Separating event from narrative, demanding evidence before accepting assertion, having the courage to ask to touch the wound before confessing divinity. In 1905, when Einstein published his revolutionary papers on relativity, he was doing in the realm of physics the same thing that Thomas had done in the realm of faith, refusing to accept the official descriptions of time and space without first verifying, asking for proof, building thought experiments, and when, years later, he was asked about God, he replied without hesitation that he believed in the God of Spinoza, the God who reveals himself in the harmonious order of the world, the God who does not play dice, the God who can be known by the human mind, because it is the very order of the human mind. And Thomas, deep down in history, smiled. Because every philosopher who asked for proof, every scientist who rejected dogmas, every student who dared to ask in class, "How do you know that?" was perpetuating the original gesture of that room in Jerusalem. They were saying in their own way, "If I do not put my finger in the place of the nails, I will not believe." And this demand, far from being spiritual weakness, was, is, and always will be the deepest engine of all that humanity has of the best. When you today open a scientific book to try to understand how your own body works, you are Thomas. When you today refuse a fake news before verifying the source, you are Thomas. When you today, in the face of a religious promise, a political promise, an advertising promise, calmly ask, "Show me," you are Thomas. There is no decent intellectual life without this question. There is no adult faith without this question. There is no science without this question. There is not even true love without this question, because loving someone is also silently asking to see that person's scars and promising not to recoil in the face of what is seen. Thomas was not the unbeliever. Thomas was the father of modernity. And we, 3 centuries after Spinoza, 20 centuries after that room in Jerusalem, are the legitimate heirs of the legacy he left. Block 12. The complete rehabilitation of Thomas came slowly, in fragments, spread over centuries of reflection. In the 20th century, after the 2 world wars, after the Holocaust, after the atomic bombs, after all the horrors produced by systems that demanded blind faith from their followers, a new generation of thinkers began to look at Thomas with completely different eyes. The French philosopher Simone Weil, although a fervent Catholic, wrote something disturbing in her notebooks. She said that the Christian who has never gone through a moment of true doubt has no faith. He only has habit, and that God, according to her, infinitely prefers the honest atheist to the conformist believer, because the honest atheist is, in his own way, in search of the truth. The conformist believer is just comfortable in the inherited lie. Weil's phrase is practically a paraphrase of what Spinoza said about Thomas 3 centuries earlier. And Weil knew this. Weil had read Spinoza attentively, and although she disagreed with many of his ideas, she recognized in this specific point an insight that the Christian tradition had resisted accepting for 2,000 years. In post-war Germany, theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, before being executed by the Nazis, wrote letters from prison in which he defended what he called adult faith. He said that infantilized faith, the faith that accepts without questioning, the faith that is based on fear of hell and hope for heaven, was a lesser form of religion, that Christianity needed to enter maturity. It needed to learn to live as if God did not exist, to use his paradoxical expression, not because God really did not exist, but because a faith that needs a buffer God to fill gaps in knowledge is a weak faith. Bonhoeffer had also read Spinoza, and although he came from a very different theological tradition, he reached conclusions that resonate deeply with Spinoza's thought about Thomas. Gradually, during the 20th century, sermons in progressive churches, in reformist synagogues, in grassroots Christian communities began to present Thomas in a different light, no longer as the unbeliever to be avoided, but as the saint to be admired. Jesuit priests began to preach that Thomas was an example of honest faith. Lutheran pastors began to teach that doubting is an essential part of the spiritual path. Reformist rabbis began to tell their congregants that asking God is a form of prayer. In 2004, Pope John Paul II, in one of his last public speeches, said a phrase that would have been unimaginable 400 years earlier. He said that the Church needed to learn from Thomas. That sincere doubt, far from being an obstacle to faith, was one of the paths by which God approaches the human soul. John Paul II did not cite Spinoza in that speech. Naturally, he did not. Spinoza was still on the Church's official list of dangerous authors, marked as a thinker to be read with extreme caution. But the content of the speech was Spinozist to the core. It was the final victory of that 23-year-old excommunicated in Amsterdam. 348 years after the rabbinical curse, the highest leader of the Catholic Church was teaching his faithful exactly what Spinoza had defended in that dark basement of Rheinsberg. History has these poetic revenges. The persecuted of one generation become the classics of the next. The heretics of one century become the saints of the following. And what was scandalous in the past transforms, over time, into conventional wisdom of the present. But perhaps the most beautiful poetic revenge is another. Perhaps it is the fact that today, in any country in the world, a child who asks their father, "How do you know this is true?" A teenager who asks their mother, "Why do I have to believe this?" A young person who asks their teacher, "What is the evidence for this claim?" These three young people, in three different places on the planet, are unknowingly making the gesture of Thomas. And they are being unknowingly defended by the silent memory of Spinoza. Every time someone dares to think for themselves, it is Spinoza who is protecting that person. Every time someone refuses an authority that does not present reasons, it is Thomas who is whispering courage in that person's ear. Every time someone chooses the uncomfortable truth over the comfortable lie, it is this long chain of honest thinkers, from Socrates to Hypatia, from Maimonides to Erasmus, from Thomas to Spinoza, from Einstein to Hannah Arendt, that is supporting that person. You are not alone when you doubt. You have never been alone. There are 20 centuries of courage supporting you. There are 20 centuries of intelligence telling you that it is okay to ask the question. There are 20 centuries of men and women who paid with their lives, with blood, with exile, so that you, today, at this moment, could hear a story like this without fear of being imprisoned. Honor this legacy. Do not waste it. Keep doubting. Keep investigating. Keep asking for evidence. Keep saying, with the ancient courage of Thomas, "If I do not put my finger in the place of the nails, I will not believe." And when finally, after so much investigation, after so much doubt, after so much demanding proof, you find something worth believing in, your faith will not be fragile like that of the 10. It will be firm like that of Thomas. It will be mature faith. It will be adult faith. It will be faith that survives storms, that withstands time, that deepens with suffering. Because true faith is not afraid of the question. True faith is built by the question. And that is why, exactly why, Thomas was, is, and always will be the greatest of the apostles. Block 13. There is a scene, recorded by a friend of Spinoza, that synthesizes everything we need to understand before reaching the end of this story. It was an ordinary afternoon in Voorburg, around 1665. Spinoza was 33 years old. He lived in a rented room in the house of a painter named Daniel Tiedemann. That afternoon, he received a visit from a young Dutch theologian, a staunch Calvinist, who had heard about him and wanted to refute him face to face. The young man entered full of prepared arguments. He had read texts against Spinoza. He had memorized refutations. He had a book of biblical citations noted to use at strategic moments. He was there to win, to bring down the heretic, to defend the true faith against the impostor. Spinoza offered tea. He sat down. He calmly listened to the young man's arguments. He did not interrupt. He did not counter. He just listened. When the young man finished, after almost an hour of uninterrupted talking, Spinoza asked a single question. He asked the young man if he had ever doubted his faith at any point in his life. The young man was indignant. He said he never had. He said his faith was firm, unshakable. That doubting was a sin. Spinoza smiled, not with irony, with sadness. And he said in that low voice that contemporaries described as musical, that then there was very little to discuss between them. Because those who have never doubted have never sought, and those who have never sought have never found, and those who have never found are merely repeating what others have told them, which is not the same as knowing. The young man left the house furious. He went away calling Spinoza all sorts of names. But it is said that years later, this same young man, now mature and having gone through his own crises, returned to The Hague to visit Spinoza's grave. And there, in silence, alone, he thanked the dead philosopher for having planted a seed that he had taken 20 years to let germinate. This scene, whether real or apocryphal, contains the essence of the entire message that this story wants to convey. Doubt is not the enemy of faith. Doubt is the tool with which adult faith is built. Those who have never doubted do not have their own faith. They have borrowed faith. They have the faith that was taught in childhood by parents, grandparents, catechists. This faith may even seem firm, it may even hold up well in times of peace, but at the first strong wind, at the first personal tragedy, at the first great existential questioning, it crumbles, because it has no foundation, because it has never been put to the test, because it has never passed through the sieve of the adult believer's conscience. The faith that survives is the faith that has been doubted, the faith that has gone through moments of disbelief, of anger, of revolt, the faith that has been rebuilt after falling. This faith is different. This faith is robust. This faith sustains the human soul in the worst hours of life, because it is not decoration. It is structure. Thomas was not the worst apostle. Thomas was the only one whose faith at the end of the process had been genuinely his. The 10 had the faith of the group, the faith of contagion, the faith of shared despair. Thomas, after that scene, had the faith of a man who had thought, suffered, waited, doubted, demanded, and finally found. And that is why Thomas, in later tradition, was the apostle who traveled the farthest. It is said that he crossed the Middle East, reached Persia, crossed Afghanistan, and was the first to bring Christianity to India, where, 2,000 years later, there are still Christian communities that identify as Thomas Christians, the Mar Thoma, direct heirs of the one who dared to ask to touch. Think about this arc. The supposed unbeliever was the one who took the message the farthest. The supposed weak one faced more dangers, crossed more deserts, founded more communities than any other apostle. The supposed doubter died, according to tradition, pierced by a spear in Mylapore, on the Indian coast, where his tomb is still visited by millions of faithful. How is it possible that the man with the least faith, according to the official version, did more for the spread of faith than anyone else? The answer is simple. Thomas had more faith, not less. His faith was the only one that had been genuinely forged from within. The faith of the others was inherited. Thomas's was built, and a built faith crosses oceans. An inherited faith does not even cross the block. Here lies, I believe, the most important lesson of this entire story. If you are in a moment of doubt in your life, you are not in decline. You are under construction. If you are questioning things you have always believed without questioning, that is not a sign that you are losing faith. It is a sign that you are finally beginning to have it. If the ready-made answers you received in childhood are no longer satisfying you, congratulations. You are leaving spiritual childhood and entering the adult phase of your inner life. Do not be afraid of this process. Spinoza was not afraid. Thomas was not afraid. All the great seekers in history went through this. It is a painful path, yes, it is a lonely path sometimes. It is a path where you will lose some people who thought they knew you. But it is also the only path that leads to a true spiritual life. The truth does not hurt. What hurts is the fear of the truth. When you can look the truth in the eye, even when the truth dismantles everything you believed, the first feeling is one of dread. The second is one of sadness. The third is one of anger. But if you hold firm, if you do not recoil into the comfortable lie, if you remain in this difficult crossing, the fourth feeling that arrives is a feeling that has no name in almost any language. It is something like peace, but deeper. It is something like freedom, but more serene. It is something like love, but cleaner. It is this feeling that Thomas felt in that room after looking at Jesus. It is this feeling that Spinoza felt on the night he finished writing the Ethics. It is this feeling that Einstein felt when he understood for the first time that time and space were curved. It is the feeling of one who has found, after having sought, after having doubted, after having demanded, after having paid the price. You can get there too. You are, in fact, closer than you think. Block 14. We are coming to the end of our journey together. And I do not want to deceive you by saying that this story has a happy ending in the conventional sense. Spinoza died young, alone, in a rented room. Thomas died pierced by a spear on a foreign shore. The bodies of both, separated by 1,600 years, lie in modest graves, in distant places, without great monuments, without great official pilgrimages compared to those of Peter or Paul. But there is another kind of ending, an ending that is not recorded in official books, but that is being written now, at this moment, inside you. You have heard this story. Something has stirred, perhaps something painful, perhaps something liberating, perhaps both. And when this video ends in a few minutes, you will get up from your chair or turn off your phone, and you will return to your daily life. The tasks will continue. The bills will continue. People will continue to ask questions, demanding answers, expecting you to agree with them on things you do not know if you agree with. But something inside you will be different. The next time someone demands faith without evidence from you, you will remember Thomas. The next time someone calls you an unbeliever for asking a reasonable question, you will remember Spinoza. The next time you feel that intimate shame for not being able to simply believe as others believe, you will know that this shame is a lie, that this shame was planted in you by systems that need obedience to sustain themselves, and you will begin to unplant this shame, slowly, patiently, without fighting with anyone, without becoming a preacher of doubt, which would just be another form of dogmatism, just living, day by day as Thomas lived, as Spinoza lived, as so many honest seekers have lived throughout the centuries, with open eyes, with a waking mind, with an available heart. This is the legacy that Spinoza left us. This is the legacy that Thomas inaugurated. This is the legacy that now passes to you. It is not an easy legacy. Those who stay awake in a world that prefers to sleep pay a price. There will be moments when you will feel loneliness. Moments when you will miss the naive security of inherited faith. Moments when you will think about giving up and returning to the comfort of simply believing what everyone believes. And when those moments come, remember this story. Remember the 23-year-old leaving Amsterdam with a bundle of books under his arm. Remember the apostle sitting silently in a corner of Jerusalem while the others embraced behind locked doors. Remember Spinoza's last words before closing his eyes forever. The truth does not hurt. What hurts is the fear of the truth. These words were spoken in Latin or in Dutch in a small room in The Hague in February of 1677, 349 years ago. But they have crossed time. They have crossed languages. They have crossed oceans. And they have reached you today, at this very moment, in the 21st century. On the other side of the planet, in some city in the world, in some room, on some couch, at some moment when you are still here, sitting, listening. Think about this improbable chain. An excommunicated Jew from Amsterdam, an apostle silenced by history, and you. 3 points on a line that crosses 20 centuries, connected by nothing but the courage not to pretend. You are not alone. You have never been. You will never be. Because every time you think for yourself, every time you ask to see with your own eyes, every time you prefer the honest question to the easy answer, you are in communion with all the Thomases and all the Spinozas who have ever existed. You are part of that invisible lineage of free minds that keeps the flame of humanity alive, even in eras when the world seems to prefer darkness. And when your day comes, when you too need to close your eyes for the last time, you will be able to say, like Spinoza, that you lived an honest life, that you did not pretend, that you did not kneel before lies just to be accepted, that you looked the truth in the eye, even when the truth was frightening and moved forward. This is the possible victory. This is the possible life. This is true faith. The story began in a closed room in Jerusalem on a Sunday night, with a dead man entering through a solid wall and an apostle in the corner saying he needed to see. It crossed seas, centuries, languages. It passed through a dark basement in Amsterdam, through a small room in The Hague, through clandestine libraries scattered across Europe, and it ended here, on a screen with you on the other side, after hours of listening, reflecting, perhaps crying a little in silence at times. The story has ended. But the path has not. The path begins now. Thomas raised his chin. Spinoza lit the candle. And you, today, at this moment, receive the same flame in your hands. Take good care of it. It is the oldest light in the world, and it is the only one that matters.